and then I will share a screen. So can everyone see the screen? Now, we saw the screen last time, but I figured after 2 weeks we need a bit of review also compared to last time. We finished the way section, but we didn't have any time to wrap it up or discuss it because we ran out of time. And since the way section is the interpretive key of the entire gospel, and starting in Jerusalem, the next section, we're going to start resolving what was introduced in the Galilee section. I thought it was good to start with a brief review of what we covered in the 2 weeks prior to our last class. So, well, in the week prior and during our last class. So, the way section begins with a question: who do human beings say that I am? Or say me to be? Whom do human beings say me to be? But in English, we say more commonly, who do human beings say that I am? And they first off give the answer of the people, which doesn't work. And then Peter says, you are the Christ, and Jesus scolds all of them not to say anything because it becomes very clear in the way section that they do not understand the Christ properly. So Jesus gives them three answers to his own question. The first one is the Son of Man must suffer much, be rejected by the chief priests, scribes, and elders, be killed and rise on the third day. Then in chapter 9, verse 30 through 32, he ups the ante because he says, the Son of Man will be handed over to Gentiles and they will kill him. And after being killed, so he mentions being killed twice. And then in chapter 10, verses 32 through 34, we get a long, detailed description of what's going to happen to him. So if people are saying that he's the Christ, and people have the wrong idea about what the Christ is, he gives a threefold repetition of what's about to happen to the Son of Man. Any questions? Then, after each of his statements about the Son of Man, we get controversies. First, Peter takes him aside and scolds Jesus, which, by the way, never do. It's always a bad move. And Jesus calls him Satan, which is about as negative as you can be, but he says, go behind me, Satan, which is reminding him of his original call to be a disciple. And the problem that Peter is facing, and all of them are facing, as we see in the controversies, is that they're thinking the things of human beings and not the things of God. And then in the second controversy, they're discussing on the way who is the greatest. And right after Jesus is talking about being put to death twice in a row, and they're worried about who's the greatest. So they're still thinking the things of human beings. They're thinking he's going to be the Messiah they want. And because of that, he's going to throw out the Romans and establish a new kingdom. And they want to be great in that kingdom. And then in the third controversy, James and John come up and say, when you sit in your glory, we want to sit at your right and left hands. In other words, be prime minister and the next person in line after prime minister. So again, they're thinking like human beings do. And there's something very interesting here, and you can't see it in English because of the way they're translating the words, but Greek has two words for know. One of them is oida, which is concrete knowledge, and the other one is gnosko, which is exactly kno in English, comes from the same place. And that's the kind of knowledge you get over time. You come to recognize something. But every time Jesus addresses his disciples in this gospel except once. He said, you don't know this parable. You don't know. You don't know. He never says that the disciples know anything except over here in 10:35 through 41, where he says, you know how the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them and how their great ones exercise. That's the only thing Jesus ever says that they actually know, which is pretty much of a critique based on what they've been asking of him. So yeah, they really do know what earthly rulers are like, but they don't understand Jesus's messiahship. They're still thinking in earthly terms. They're still thinking the things of human beings instead of the things of God. And then we go to the hard teachings. And if you think about it, since these all form a complex, what happens up here with Jesus, the Son of Man, is reflected in what is going to be required of his disciples. And the interpretive key is if they think like God, if they think the things of God instead of the things of human beings, this will make sense. But it never seems to make an impression. But look at these hard teachings. If anyone wants to come after me, that one must deny oneself and follow me. So self-denial. And pick up the cross. So all of us who want to follow Jesus are going to have to carry a cross, not necessarily a physical one, but we're going to have a cross. Then he says, anyone who wants to save one's life, and remember the word life there is psyche, which means the fullness of your being, not just your physical life. In Greek, you can actually use that word to mean oneself. You must destroy yourself in order to save it. If you want to save yourself, you must be willing to destroy yourself in order to save it. And then he lowers the boom on them and says, if you're ashamed of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will be ashamed of you when he comes with the glory of his Father and the holy angels. That's the final judgment. So the important thing is who decides what your final judgment is. We already saw this back in by the measure with which you measure, it will be measured out to you. You decide if you are ashamed of Jesus and his words and you do not put them into effect, then Jesus is going to be ashamed of you at the most critical moment of your existence when your judgment happens. These are hard teachings, right?
Hmm.
And then we go to the second set of hard teachings where, okay, you all want to be great. Okay, you disciples. The great one among you is the one who serves. But they don't get that. And then he comes over here and he says, well, you have to be willing to drink the cup that I will drink and be baptized with my baptism. And they jump at the chance, even though they have no idea what James and John are agreeing to. And then the remaining 10 come up and they're angry because James and John got to Jesus first, not because they were asking the wrong thing. And Jesus says, if you want to be great, you must be servant of all and slave of all, because the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Now, in these two, Jesus says that if you want to be great, you have to be a servant. And the word for that is diakonos, from which we get the English word deacon. But in this culture, serving is reserved to women if they're poor, and if they can afford to have a slave, then it's reserved to the slave. So it was considered in this culture, serving was women's work, Remember, men are in charge of everything. It's women's work, and only a rich woman could have a slave do it for her. And in this gospel, Jesus is served by the angels. He's served by Simon's mother-in-law. He tells the men twice they have to be servants, and this makes no impression on them because being a servant is women's work or slaves' work. So they completely misunderstand or refuse to understand. They have hardened hearts, remember? They refuse to understand what Jesus is saying. They want the Messiah they want instead of the one God is offering. But now we, the audience, know what Jesus expects of us. Even if we, like the disciples, don't want to hear it and refuse to listen, we know what's expected of us. And one of my favorite parts of this, he says, well, if you do not accept the reign of God, if you do not accept a child like you receive the reign of God, you will not enter into it. Remember, children in this culture, a subsistence culture, are a gamble because you need them to support you when you get older, but there are long years of having to feed them. And with the mortality rate being what it was, you could feed them for a very long time and they could die of something. And all of that is wasted investment. And that's what Jesus is telling us about work for the reign of God. You've got to take it on like you take on a child. Years and years of hopeful support that something eventually good will come out of it. So he's not promising anything easy, fun, but he's promising something that ultimately we can hope is worthwhile. Any questions or comments? Okay, there I go being too clear again. So we just finished the way section. We are beginning the Jerusalem section here in chapter 11, verse 1. Now we should start to expect some parallels to develop. And because of my crazy computer, I can't quite fit this all on the same screen because if it gets any smaller, I can't see it and my screen isn't big enough. But this is the center. So what is the mirror image of the first part of the Jerusalem section, the A part? The mirror image of that is the A prime section of the Galilee section, right? So we would expect what is introduced here to start to be resolved here because it's concentrically arranged. Now, who remembers what was the first thing that happened up here in the A prime part of the Galilee section? Who can remember what was in that intercalation? Anybody? Jesus sends out the 12 to preach and to cast out demons, and they're incredibly successful. So what have we learned about the disciples in the middle, in the way section? They still aren't getting it. So what happens at the beginning of the Jerusalem section? Jesus sends out two disciples to get a colt for him. Notice that's a big downgrade, isn't it? He does need a colt, don't get me wrong, but it's a big, big downgrade from what they were sent out to do last time. And we can see why they still don't get it from the from the way section. I should also point out that down here, Jesus also sends out his disciples, but this time it's to prepare a meal. So they're doing more menial tasks rather than going out and proclaiming and casting out demons. You can trust them with small jobs, but they're not too reliable for big jobs anymore. Now, I want to, any questions about that?
I want to ask a question because it seems to me like they're not ever going to get this as long as Jesus is still with them.
Well, it sounds like you might have read through the whole gospel, and the answer to that is yes, they never do get it. They never, ever, ever get it. And that's going to be a very important part of the ending of Mark's gospel. But you are correct. They never.
I was hoping.
Well, you see, the problem you're hoping is because you probably read the other gospels where they get it and they do wonderful things, but not here. In Mark's gospel, they never get it.
Hello, Prof. I also want to say that, well, even I myself, and I guess the rest of us also, we are finding it challenging, and the way you are presenting it, that the message of Mark, as Mark is putting it about Jesus, is very challenging, and it's a real call for a change of mentality to embrace this, and even up to today. And if one really wants to think about the demands of Jesus.
Yes, and what does Jesus say? The first words out of his mouth: change your mindset, repent. That's why we're still reading it today. We haven't gotten it right yet. That's why the church has passed on Mark's gospel to us. I mean, we've got all four. But the point is that we haven't done this, gotten it right, and can move on. We're always in this position. So that's why we have these gospels to challenge us. I don't know if you were here. I think you told me that you've watched all of them, all of the videos. But if you remember, in the first couple of days, classes, I mentioned that I ran a Bible study for 10 years with mostly the members of campus ministry and interested students while I was teaching. And one of the campus ministers came up to me after 2 or 3 years and just said, every week I come here for consolation and all you give me is a kick in the butt. And I said, great, I'm doing my job. Yes, there's a lot consoling here, but the constant message is get it right, get it right. It's not here to make me feel good. It's here to challenge me.
Yeah.
And promise that there's a happy ending. But we'll have to see what Mark does with that.
Okay, thank you.
Anything else? Okay, so now I'm going to have to stop that and go to the text. We can finally start. Now, I apologize that everything is in white and black instead of black and white, but my eyes are really not doing too well today. And I can see this more easily. I think it's the very dry weather we've been having. My eyes are having problems. Now, I want you to listen carefully to the first 6 verses, or maybe 7, and then I'm going to break and ask a question. Okay? Mm-hmm. And when they drew near to Jerusalem, to Bethphage, to Bethania, towards the Mount of Olives, he sent 2 of his disciples, and he says to them, go into the village opposite you, and immediately on entering into it, you will find a colt tied on which no human being ever sat. Untie it and bring. We'd say bring it in English. And if anyone says to you, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? Say, the Lord has need of it, and immediately will send it. He is sending it. This is Mark's narrative style, and he's sending it back again here. And they went forth and found a colt tied at the gate, outside, on the street, and they are untying it. And some of the ones standing there were saying to them, what are you doing untying the colt? But they said to them, just as Jesus said to them, and they permitted them. Okay, I'm going to stop here for a second. What's different about this from everything we've heard before? Anybody see it or feel what's different here?
Does it seem that is coming out? Jesus is coming out more decidedly to like maybe taking charge and going out to more in the open?
I don't know. Could you repeat that one time?
So I'm saying, does it mean that it seems Jesus is giving more directive now and concerning?
He is. He's giving very explicit instructions to his obviously not very attentive disciples who failed to pay attention to him for 3 chapters during the way section. That's correct. So good observation. Anything else?
They're using his name.
They're using
his name there. When he told them to, if anybody asked, why are you taking this colt? Because the Lord has need of it. And I don't remember him giving instructions to use his name specifically with people.
good. So he's being very specific now. He's giving them lots of information. We've just gone through 6 verses, and what have they accomplished? They untied a colt and brought it.
Yes.
We've had miracle stories that were 4 verses long. We've only had 2 stories in this gospel so far that were longer than this. One was the parable of the sower, and one of them was the story of the demoniac who had legion. But the pace has slowed down dramatically.
Hmm.
We've spent 10 chapters on Jesus's whole life, and now we've got 6 chapters on the last 7 days. So we've moved from immediately, him doing 3, 4, 5, 6 things on a day to almost a play-by-play of the action. He's being very specific in what he's telling them. What's happening is being narrated point by point. It's not, he entered into the synagogue, he saw this, he did that, everybody's amazed. It's no longer that. We're into almost real-time narration. In a movie, this would be like going from a panoramic shot to a close-up. So now we're really focused on every single thing that's going to happen. And what's the first 2 things he points out? He's being very specific at this point. He's entrusting lesser tasks to his disciples, and he's he's even giving them hints as to the proper way to reference him. Say the Lord has need of it. They still haven't called him that in this gospel. Okay? So things are changing. And they brought the colt to Jesus, and they cast upon it their garments, and he sat on it. So point by point, step by step, we're getting a very clear image of what's going on. And many strewed their cloaks onto the way, but others were cutting leafy branches from the fields. Okay, now I'm going to have to leave this for a moment, and we'll come right back to it. But I have to tell you what's going on here. When David was crowned king, he went up onto the Mount of Olives. He got on a colt. He rode down the King's Highway. Remember, that's where Jesus had just cured Bartimaeus on the other side of Mount Olives. He rode down on a colt. Why? To signify that he was a humble and meek Messiah, or in Greek, a humble and meek Christ, or in English, a humble and meek anointed one. And he rode into Jerusalem and he was crowned king. Then, after the temple was built, and I have a graph here, and I hope this works. That's why I had to do this. He goes up on the Mount of Olives. He's going to come down, and he's going to go into the east gate of the city of Jerusalem, and he's going to go to the temple. And here's the temple, okay? So he's going to imitate what happened when the kings of ancient Israel after David were crowned, which was they rode on a colt to show their humility. They rode in through the east gate of the city. They went through the streets. They rode in through the east entrance of the temple. They progressed through the court of women and Gentiles, where unclean things could be, into the court of men, where clean people, only clean men could be. And then he was crowned, the to-be king was crowned king, and the choir would sing, "You are my son, this day have I begotten you." In other words, when he was crowned king, God adopted the Davidic monarch as king. Are there any questions about that sequence of events? Okay. Can everybody see the text now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
good. But he runs into a problem in verse 8. And there are three problems before we even get to the temple. And many were strewed, it's aorist, their cloaks onto the way, but others were cutting leafy branches from the fields. This is a problem because the way to welcome a new to-be crowned Jewish king is to throw your cloaks on the ground as a sign of respect. But this cutting leafy branches, they cut the leafy branches and they wave them. This is not a Jewish custom. This is a Roman custom. And it's the way you welcome the emperor when he returns victorious from battle. So what kind of a reception is Jesus getting? He's getting some of them recognizing that he is like a humble Davidic monarch, and others are looking for a conquering general, a political Messiah. So that's problem number one. I should warn you, in the other Gospels, the entry into Jerusalem is completely joyous and wonderful. In Mark, it's a catastrophe. It's an absolute catastrophe. Problem number two. And the ones going before him and the ones following him were crying out, "What's the problem now?" What is the proper spatial relationship to Jesus? You follow him. And notice what they are crying out. Problem number three. Hosanna, God save. Blessed is the one coming with the name of the Lord. That's good. He does have the Lord's name. Blessed is the coming reign of our father David. What do they want?
They want a king.
They want a political king. So we've got three catastrophes happening in 3 verses. Hosanna in the highest. And notice Jesus's reaction. And he came into Jerusalem, into the temple. So he gets right to the entrance to the temple and looking around at everything, since already the hour of, it was the hour of evening, he went forth to Bethany with the 12. He can't go in. Why not?
It's too late.
Well,
He's not fulfilling the prophecy.
if he's crowned king, it's ambiguous because he's not a military Messiah. He's a humble Messiah. He can't go in there because the people who are doing what they are doing are welcoming him as a king, but he's only half of the people are welcoming him as the proper type. And this is very important because in the other Gospels, he just walks right in and starts teaching, but he can't do it in Mark because he would be sending the wrong signal. All he does is get up to the entrance to the temple, looks in, and turns around. He cannot walk in because he would be sending a political message to half the people.
Mm-hmm.
So the crowd, some of them recognize who he is and say the right thing, and some of them don't recognize who he is, precede him and shout a political statement. He can't walk in. Okay? Now, this is important because it's going to take 3 days for Jesus to start teaching in the temple. And I hate to keep doing this, but I want you to see it. Okay. I can't see it and point out to you what you need to know at the same time. The first day he gets here to the brink of the temple. The next day he only gets into the court of women and Gentiles, where you can have unclean things like money changers. It's not until the third day he finally gets into the court of men where he can start teaching. It's almost, if you think about it, each day he penetrates a little bit deeper into the temple. Mark presents it almost as if the temple is fighting back. And we all know who runs the temple. The chief scribes and elders. So it's like the temple is fighting back. And remember, way back to the first day, when I pointed out the different sections and I told you what the wilderness section was about, what Galilee was about, what the way was about, what Jerusalem was about, I pointed out that Mark turns Jerusalem on its head because in the scriptures, Jerusalem is the holy city where God's name resides. And in Mark, it's the place of failure because the temple is going to fail. The religious authorities are going to fail. His disciples are going to fail. And last of all, it looks like Jesus failed, but it just looks like that. So instead of it being the place where God's Messiah is going to reign and bring peace and a land of milk and honey and all that good stuff, it's a place of utter failure and disaster from Mark's perspective. Okay? Any questions? I really wish I knew how to do graphics, but I can barely navigate. So it would be better if I could do that, but I can't. Okay. And he went to Bethany with the 12. And now we come up to an intercalation. Remember, an intercalation is you start a story, you interrupt it with a second story, and then you finish the first story. And what does Mark want us to do with an intercalation? The inside and the outside are related and have the same theme, idea, or point, right? Any questions before we start this intercalation? And the next day, when they were coming forth from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing a fig tree from a distance having leaves, he came, whether he might then find something on it, and coming upon it, he found nothing except leaves, because it wasn't the season for figs. And responding, so he responds to the fig tree. He responds to the fig tree, to it, and responding to it, he said, oh gosh, where are the pieces of this? May no one eat fruit from you into the next stage. In other words, after the judgment. So for the rest of the world, it's not going to produce fruit. And his disciples were listening. So Jesus curses the fig tree. Now, this does not mean that Jesus is anti-horticulture or ecology. This is a prophetic act, and we have to keep that in mind. He's doing a prophetic act when he curses the fig tree. So it means something other than something about the fig tree. And that something else occurs in the middle of the intercalation. Any questions so far? And when they came into Jerusalem, and they came into Jerusalem, and entering into the temple, he began to cast out the ones selling and the ones buying. This all occurred in the court of women and Gentiles because you could have unclean people and things there. And the tables of the money changers and the seats of the ones selling the doves he turned over. Now, since only holy things, clean things could enter, not holy, but only clean things could enter into the temple any further. When you came in, you had to exchange your Roman denarii, which is the national currency, for temple shekels, which were clean. So a money changer would be there. You'd put your unclean denarii on one side, and they'd measure out. It was 2 shekels to a denarius in the first century at the time of Jesus. So for every denarius you put down, you'd get 2 shekels back, which were then clean, and you could put them in the treasury in the court of men. If you were a woman, you still had to buy clean coins, but you put them into the treasury in the court of women. Okay? So the collection basket. So this is where all the unclean stuff is going on. And what does he do? He turns over the tables. He turns over the seats. He did not permit that anyone carry a vessel through the temple. And he was teaching them and saying to them, hasn't it been written, my house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations, but you have made it a cave of thieves. That's the middle story. Well, we've got one more verse. Let's finish that up. And the chief priests and the scribes heard and were seeking how they might destroy him. For they feared him because all the crowd was astonished at his teaching. Okay? So notice, Jesus's actions are turning over tables, turning over seats, forbidding people to walk back and forth carrying stuff through the, it's not a place of commerce. It should not be, at least. It should be a house of prayer for all the nations. And he's saying this in the court of women where all the nations could enter because it was open to unclean people. And when it became evening, he went forth outside of the city. And passing along early the next day, they saw the fig tree withered from the roots. And Peter, remembering, says to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered. That's the end of the first story. So how do we put these two stories together? Oh, and I have to tell you, Jesus is turning over the tables and the chairs and not permitting people to carry things. That is a prophetic action. So we have 2 prophetic actions back to back inside of an intercalation. How does Mark want us to interpret this intercalation? Well, let me ask you a question. When is it when, and well, I can't ask you that question because you'd have to read Josephus, the historian of the Jewish war when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple. The Romans came in, and when they destroyed the court of women, they turned over the tables and, stuff like that. Jesus's actions are prophetic action predicting the destruction of the temple by the Romans about 35 years in the future, maybe 45 years, depending on when this occurred. Mm-hmm. That happened around the year 70. the Jewish people went into revolt and the Romans came in and wiped out everything. Well, wiped out all the men and the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the elders, and sold the women and children into slavery. So what does this intercalation tell me Jesus is doing when he cleanses the temple?
Fulfilling the prophecy.
Well, he's making a prophecy of what?
The destruction of the temple.
Yeah, he's proleptically or in advance enacting the destruction of the temple. And how does that fit with the cursing of the fig tree and it withered? What Jesus prophetically enacts happens. Now, this is a major point for Mark. If you go to the other Gospels, this does not happen. In fact, Luke is very clear. When Jesus cleanses the temple, he purifies it so that he can teach there. But not for Mark. Jesus condemns the temple to death, which is the failure of the temple. It wasn't producing what it was supposed to produce. It was producing a lot of commerce and very little anything else. Now, why didn't Jesus come out and say, I am enacting the destruction of the temple? He could be put to death for doing that. You can't speak against God's house. But a prophetic action cannot be criticized. And can anybody think of a prophetic action from the scriptures? Anybody remember Jeremiah? What was Jeremiah doing? He was going around and saying, this city is going to fall, Jerusalem is going to fall. And the king had enough of it and arrested him and threw him in a cistern and came to him 36 hours or so later and says, if you promise not to say the city is going to fall and be destroyed, I'll let you out. And Jeremiah said, fine, I promise. And the next day, what did he do? Anybody remember?
He said it was going to be destroyed again.
No, he didn't, because he promised. He did a prophetic action. He went into the main marketplace of Jerusalem, stark naked, with his hands bound, and just walked back and forth. That is a prophetic action predicting the downfall of Jerusalem. Why? Because what the Neo-Babylonians did when they conquered a country was that they stripped their king naked and made him walk back and forth in front of his subjects.
I forgot that.
But you can't be arrested for a prophetic action. So he was doing the same thing the next day. He was prophetically enacting the king being dragged naked in front of his people. But he didn't say it, so they couldn't do anything about it. I guess they didn't have decency laws back then. But so this is a prophetic action. He prophetically enacts the withering and destruction of the temple.
So the fig tree, he cursed the fig tree because it wasn't producing figs. And is that a parallel to the fact that the temple wasn't
producing what it was supposed to do? It was supposed to be a house of prayer for all the nations, but it has become a cave of thieves.
So the fig tree is just a sort of a parallel.
Well, it's a prophetic action. But we don't know what it means until Mark sticks it into the intercalation. And then what Jesus does on the inside is the equivalent of cursing the temple. And then we find out when Jesus curses something, it happens. And the implication that we draw from it is that the temple is going to be destroyed. And this is very important because what's the first charge they're going to bring against him at his trial? He said that he would destroy this temple. No. He enacted it prophetically. You can't charge someone for prophetic action.
Paul,
Why not?
Yes,
could I ask a question? And this is very, very naive, but it's very sincere. Why is this not made clearer for readers like me who want to understand? I was baffled by the fig tree being cursed, and there's nothing there to tell me, well, this is like what is going to happen to the temple. Why is it kept so obscure?
because it wasn't obscure to the original hearers.
Ah, okay.
First century Christians would and Jews would know what's going on here. It's a prophetic action. They would know that you can't be arrested for or charged for prophetic actions.
Okay, now I understand. For
Yeah,
me,
and
it's
and you can see that the chief priests and scribes get the point right away.
Mhm,
They want to destroy him, but they can't. He's eluding their legal means of arresting him.
mhm.
And that's going to be a theme of chapters 11 and 12. Jesus is made out of Teflon in chapters 11 and 12. You cannot get a hold on him. He's slippery.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Okay.
Professor,
Yes.
so this man who rides in on a donkey into the temple and at some point starts speaking about the temple as my father's house, why isn't that being raised as a charge of blasphemy?
Because it's a direct quote of the scripture. It's a direct quote from Isaiah, which is he's quoting, he says, it has been written. So he's going to give a quote. That's the way it's always been. You know, when in the beginning, as just the gospel begins with, just as it has been written, I am sending my messenger before your face. The I is God, but it's a prophetic statement. And since you introduce it with this word gegraptai, that means I'm about to quote scripture. So he's just saying what Isaiah said.
And the original readers would have understood that.
Sure, don't we understand it? Well, did Isaiah prophesy, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Jesus isn't talking about himself. He's quoting what Isaiah, me as God in that quote,
Okay.
because because it's introduced as a prophetic utterance.
Mhm.
So, you know, when I can say, don't kill, it's been written, don't kill. That's one of the 10 commandments. I'm not saying I'm telling you this, it's God telling you this,
Oh, right. Right.
right?
Mhm.
Okay. Okay, now things are getting more and more dense as we go along. I'm looking at the time. And when evening happened, okay, went forth from the city. We read that. So we're up to 11:20. But going along early, no, we're way past there. Where do I need to be? Ah,
22.
22. So Peter says, Rabbi, look, the fig tree which you cursed has withered is withered in Mark. And responding, Jesus says to them, and this is impossible to translate with less than a paragraph. Basically, it's have faith of God. What does that mean? Well, it can mean one of two things in Greek. And as I told you, whenever something is polysemous or having multiple meanings, I insist on using all of them. Oh, and why doesn't somebody tell you what it means? That's why you buy a Catholic study Bible, because they'll tell you that in margins. I guess I should say that right away. You know, if you're not expected to know it, either in the margins or the footnote, it'll say, this is what's going on. That's why you use a study Bible instead of a Bible.
Thank you.
Okay, okay. I don't get commissions, so don't think badly of me when I say that. I don't get commissions on the Catholic Study Bible. And responding to what Peter just says, Jesus says, have faith of God. Now, this has two possible meanings, and I want to keep both of them. It can mean have the faith that comes from God. After all, faith is a gift, like everything, every other good thing is. But it can also mean have faith into God. Remember, faith is dynamic in the New Testament, so it's always in motion. We'd say have faith in God in modern English, but the Greeks would say have faith into God. So what he's telling them is have what God's offering you and use it. This faith, it comes from God and it's directed back to God. Amen. Truth, I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, and he's probably pointing to Mount Zion here, and then we have another ambiguity. It either means be taken up and cast into the sea, or take yourself up and cast yourself into the sea, because he's talking to the mountain. In Greek, you can't see this in English. He's talking to the mountain as if it's alive. Because if he were talking to an inanimate object, he would have to use a preposition plus the accusative, but he's just using the dative here. So he says, so it's either be taken up and be cast into the sea, or take yourself up and cast yourself into the sea, and does not doubt in one's heart, but believes that what one says happens, it will be for him or her. So if you've got enough faith, you can tell that mountain and talk to it as if it's alive to do something. Because of this, I say to you, everything for whatsoever for which you pray and ask, believe that you receive it and it will be yours. Now, he's going to come back and qualify that statement later. So you're not going to get whatever you ask for. Anybody know what the qualification is going to be? Anybody read chapter 14? It's going to be if it's according to God's will, which is a big if. And when you stand praying, and we've got, and when you stand praying, we've got pictorial and written documentation that early Christians stood with their hands parallel to the sky, so their palms were facing up, and that's the way they prayed. But when you stand praying, forgive if you hold anything against another, in order that also your Father in the heavens may forgive for you your trespasses. Now, notice the sequence here. We talked about this once before, but it was in relation to the Lord's Prayer, which does not appear in Mark's Gospel. It appears only in Matthew and Luke, and it's different in those two Gospels. The one we say at Mass is from Matthew's Gospel. What's the order? First, you forgive what you hold against another, in order that that's the premise. The conclusion is your Father in the heavens will forgive for you your trespasses. Okay? And I was talking with a member of the class, and I was asked to make a clarification at this point. So any questions about what I just said? Forgiveness starts with us, and God's response is to forgive for us. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
So if we don't forgive, we don't get things forgiven. Same thing in the Our Father. Forgive for us our trespasses as we forgive those that trespasses against us. So first we forgive, then we forgive others' trespasses, and then God forgives ours. Okay?
Mhm.
And if you paid attention to how I just said that, I've started to explain the difference between Greek and English. And I touched on this briefly, but I'm going to go into it a little bit more in depth. To forgive is a phiemi, which is very abbreviated in the subjunctive here, but the dictionary form is a phiemi. It's a very long word. Here you can see an indicative form of it. It's much longer. Subjunctive is much shorter. In Greek, the word forgive is from economics. It's like when a bank, well, we would forgive a loan, or if somebody owes you something and you forgive that debt. It's a cancellation. And because it's a cancellation in Greek as opposed to English, you cannot forgive people because you can't cancel them. You can only forgive trespasses and sins. And this goes back to Mosaic law. When you break a Mosaic law, you incur a debt to God, which we call sin. And since 90% of the Mosaic laws are about how we interact with each other, we also incur a debt to the other person that we sinned against. And Jesus says we have to delete or cancel those debts for others. Remember, you can't forgive a person, you can only forgive a debt in Greek. And I think that's very important because people will say, oh, I can't forgive you for doing that. Well, you can't. That's right. You cannot forgive somebody for doing that. You can only forgive the debt that person owes to you incurred by sinning against you. You can forgive, you can delete that, you can let go of that. The Greek word aphiemi means to let go, basically. Actually, it's off and iemi, which means go away from. So you can forgive, you can make the debt go away, you can cancel it, but you can't cancel a person. So if you've ever said, I really can't forgive you for doing that in English, that's not a problem. You've got to forgive the debt. I once told a student, I said, I try to forgive all debts against me, but I avoid the people who do that to me because that person sins against me. So I'm going to avoid the person, but I'm going to let the debt go. I'm not going to hold the debt. And that's what God does. Why do you have to let the debt go? Think about it. When you sin against God, is there any way to make up for that? No, it's an event. It happened. It's in the past. It's done. It's a permanent debt. So God says, well, I'll just let go of that. I'll cancel it if you're willing to cancel the debts of other people. You see how the Greek understanding is very different from the English?
Hmm.
God doesn't want us coming to our judgment holding on to the debts. I hate to say it, but it's like the Christmas Carol, you can't hold on to all of this stuff. You got to let it go. And if you do that, then God will let go of the debts you owe God. There's a reason that the prophets said that God and then God's representative is a Prince of Peace, because the only way you can have peace is to let go of the debts owed to you. They weigh you down and they weigh the other person down. You got to let all of that go. That's a very different concept from English. Are there any questions about that before we proceed? I think that the Greek understanding of forgive is much healthier, because in English you can either forgive a person, forgive a debt. In Greek, all you can do is forgive debts. In Hebrew, all you can do is forgive debts. That makes sense. You can let go of the debt owed to you. You just let it go and you move on. Okay, I'm assuming that we've got it. Now we're starting into another very dense section. What's going to happen between verse 27 of chapter 11 and the end of chapter 12 is that Jesus is going to come into direct conflict with every teacher of first century Judaism. He's going to come into conflict with the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Then he's going to come into conflict with the Pharisees and Herodians. And then he's going to come into conflict with the Sadducees. And each time, he is going to demolish them. Absolutely demolish their arguments. Okay? So let's get started. And we're only going to get through the first one today because it's very complex. And entering again into Jerusalem and into the temple, he was walking around when he was walking around, there came toward him the chief priests, scribes, and the elders. So now he's in the court of men. It's day 3. He's finally made it all the way into the place where he can do teaching. He's in the court of men. And the chief priests, scribes, and elders came to him. Now they are the ones who Jesus said back in chapter 8, verse 31, it is necessary that the Son of Man be rejected by the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Now he's meeting up with this group for the first time in the gospel. And they were saying to him, by what sort of authority do you do these things? Or alternatively, who gave to you this authority so that you do these things? So you can either say by what sort of authority or who gave it to you. Now, Jesus is going to respond to the chief priests, scribes, and elders as a rabbi would. This is very cute on Mark's part. If you go up to, if you're a Jew and you go up to a rabbi and you say, Rabbi, is it permitted to do X? In the first century, the rabbi will say, well, is it permitted to do Y? And he thinks you know the answer to Y, and that's the answer to your question. See how it works? If you ask a rabbi a question, he'll respond with a question that he thinks you know the answer to, so that you can get the answer to the one you want. This reinforces your knowledge of the law and all that good stuff. It's a good teaching device. Drove my students crazy when I used to do this to them. Usually an answer to the question, is it going to be on the test? And I'd say, is anything I say in class unimportant? You know, okay. But Jesus said to them, I will ask you one word, and you respond to me, that's a command. And I will say to you by what sort of authority I do these things. So he comes back with a question. Here's his question. The baptism of John was from heaven or from human beings? Answer me. So the answer would either be heaven or human beings. That's the one word. But notice what they do. These are the chief priests, scribes, and elders. The chief priests are the primary teachers of ancient Israel, you know. And they were discussing, facing one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, because of which thing, therefore, did you not believe into him? But if we say from human beings, they feared the crowd because all of them were holding John thus, that he was a prophet. So they asked him a religious question. He asked them a religious question. What is their discussion about?
They're gaming the problem.
Well, they're gaming the problem by they're weighing what are the political implications of their answer. They're supposed to be religious teachers. So how does this make them look? They obviously don't think that John's baptism was from heaven because they didn't pay any attention to it, but the people do, and they don't want to be at odds with the people. So, and responding to Jesus, they say, "We do not know." They're the religious leaders of Israel. But they're more concerned with the political ramifications of what they say than the truth. But Jesus let them know because they all know Jesus thinks that John's baptism was from heaven. He got baptized himself. He thought John was a prophet.
Professor?
Yeah. Okay. Can I finish this and then answer that quick?
Yes.
Let me just say this. And responding, they said, "We do not know." Jesus says to them, "Nor am I saying to you by what sort of authority I do these things." Okay, question.
So the chief priests and elders walk up to Jesus in the temple. Should we assume that other people are standing around listening to this
Oh, yeah. As soon as
conversation?
the chief priests are there, everybody's listening.
Okay. In that regard, then, are the chief priests and the elders and so on, is their first reaction not to believe that Jesus is setting a trap, and their first priority is to stay out of the trap?
They are setting a trap for Jesus. Because if he says, "My authority is from God," they'll say, "Give us a prophetic sign." And if he can't produce one, a sign from heaven, he's guilty of blasphemy. If he says, "My authority is from human beings," then they can laugh at him and everybody thinks Jesus is a charlatan. The traps are being set by his opponents. There are 3 traps about to be set, and Jesus not only gets out of all 3 of them, but he makes his opponents look like fools. Because he made the chief priest admit in the presence of all the men gathered there that they don't know the answer to a religious question. Now they didn't believe in John. It's obvious because none of them went out to see him, but they're afraid to say it in front of the people who do believe John was a prophet. So, so the only thing they can say is, "We don't know," which makes them look like very ignorant religious teachers. Because from the perspective of the people gathered there, it's obvious that John was a prophet. So it shows that they're not saying what they truly believe. So they're lying. We don't know. They also look like poor teachers if they do not know. Anything else before we move on? Now before we move on, this is Jesus's further statement. He's talking to the chief priests, scribes, and elders. They're still there looking stupid in front of the people. And then Jesus tells them a parable. And he began to speak to them by means of parables. A human being planted a vineyard and placed a fence around it and dug a wine press and built a tower and leased it to farmers and went away on a journey. Now, as soon as he says this, everybody knows the parable already. And let's see if I can find it. This occurs in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 1. Ta-da, okay. And I'm going to translate it. I'm going to read the Greek. I'm going to read the English, so I don't have to go through the whole translation, but I'm going to correct it. Let me now sing of my beloved, not my friend. It's beloved, agapetos. We see it right there. I'm going to sing of my beloved song concerning his vineyard. My beloved had a vineyard on a fertile hillside. He spaded it and cleared it of stones and planted, notice, the choicest vines. Within it, he built a watchtower. He hewed out a wine press, and he looked for the crop of grapes, but what it yielded was sour grapes. Now, inhabitants of Jerusalem and people of Judah, judge between me and my vineyard. This is God talking. It's a prophetic parable. What more was there to do for my vineyard that I had not done? Why, when I looked to it for the crop of grapes, did it bring forth wild grapes? Now I will let you know what I will do, what I mean to do to my vineyard. Take away its hedge, give it over to grazing, break through its wall, let it be trampled. Yes, I will make it a ruin. It shall not be pruned or hoed, but overgrown with thorns and bristles. I will command the clouds to send no rain upon it. The vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the human beings of Judah are his cherished plant. So we have the planted a vineyard, wine press, dug a wine press, built the tower. We've got all of these parallels. So this is Isaiah's parable of the vineyard. Now in Isaiah, this is the beginning of the parable of the vineyard. It ends way 48 or so chapters later. What's the system? The kingdom of Judah is producing wild grapes. They're inedible. You can't make wine out of them. So what's God going to do? God's going to destroy the vineyard, send the inhabitants of the vineyard into exile. That's chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah. And then when they get purified in the exile, God's going to bring them back. So when Jesus starts his parable and uses all those key words, everybody knows what the parable is going to be. But it is a true parable because Jesus does something outrageous with it. Remember, the system is the vineyard doesn't produce what it's supposed to. God destroys it, sends the people into exile where they get purified, and then God sends them back to rebuild the vineyard. Okay? Everybody knows the plot before Jesus gets out of verse 1. Any questions? Okay, let's see what Jesus does with this parable. It's just remarkable. And he sent to the farmers in season or at the proper time, same expression in Greek, a slave so that he might take some of the fruit of the vineyard from the farmers. That's typical. They didn't use a lot of money. If you rented out a place, you got a percentage of the produce. And taking him, that slave, they beat him and sent him empty. We'd say empty-handed. And again, he sent to them another slave, and that one they beat on the head and treated dishonorably. And he sent another, and that one they killed, and many others, some of whom, on the one hand, they beat, others of whom, on the other hand, they killed. He was having one, a beloved son. He still had one, was having one, a beloved son. Now, as soon as Jesus says this, the audience knows who the beloved son is, right? Because in the original parable, the vineyard owner was God. Now he's got a beloved son. This is a new thing in the parable. He sent him last of all and saying, now this can be translated two ways, and I don't like the way it's translated, so I'm going to translate it both ways for you. The typical way of translating it is, they will respect my son. But you can use this form for what is called in Greek a future emphatic injunction. What does that mean? They will respect my son. That's a threat. Or they better respect my son. But those farmers said to one another, this is the heir. Remember, he's only got one left, a beloved son. He killed a son, nobody left. This is the heir. Come, let's kill him, and the inheritance will be ours, because there won't be anybody else to leave it to. And taking him, they killed him and cast him outside of the vineyard. What then will the Lord of the vineyard do? Well, we all know from Isaiah, God will destroy the vineyard, send the farmers into exile to be purified, and when they're purified, come back. That's the ending everybody is waiting to hear. Jesus turning Isaiah's parable into his parable does something extraordinary. Remember, all parables have something extraordinary. What will the Lord of the vineyard do? He will come and destroy the farmers, not the vineyard, the farmers, and give the vineyard to others. So Jesus changes Isaiah's system. What's the first implication? No more second chances. What's the second implication? The people of Israel, God's people, will no longer be destroyed. Their leaders will be destroyed. Who is he saying this parable to? He's addressing it directly to the chief priests, scribes, and elders, but everybody else is listening. Who are the farmers of the vineyard? Who are the runners of the temple where he's standing? The chief priests, scribes, and elders. And then he finishes up here. You've read this scripture, haven't you? He expects a yes answer. The stone which the ones building rejected, this one has become the head of the corner. We'd say the cornerstone, but he's thinking of an arch where the head is what holds the arch together. From the Lord this came to be, and it is a marvel in our eyes. Now remember, the only other time rejected is used in this gospel is the Son of Man will be rejected by the chief priests, scribes, and elders. Who's he telling the parable to? The chief priests, scribes, and elders. The stone which the building ones or the ones building rejected. This one has become the head of the corner. From the Lord this came to be, and it is a marvel in our eyes. And they were seeking to seize him, and they feared the crowd, because they knew that to them he said this parable. And going away, they left him. Now, this is a second remarkable thing going on here. Do you see what it is? They knew he said this parable to them. This is the first parable in this gospel which we have a statement that somebody understood. Every other time, Jesus has to explain his parables. So the only time Jesus is a successful parable sayer in this gospel, he is understood completely by the chief priests, scribes, and elders, his enemies. I mean, if Jesus didn't have bad luck in this gospel, he'd have no luck in this gospel, right? They knew that he spoke this parable to them, and they wanted to seize him. This word is going to be used later. How are they translating it in verse 12? Arrest, yeah. They wanted to seize him. Remember, whenever Jesus seizes, he does a healing. Whenever they seize, it's for death. So it's a contrast between chief priests, scribes, and elders and Jesus, because they knew he spoke this parable to them. Now, what's interesting about this, and I'm just going to let it out there, and it's going to have to hang until chapter 14, which is the other side of the A part of Jerusalem. It's the A prime part of Jerusalem. They're going to accuse Jesus of saying he's going to destroy the temple. Remember? Mm-hmm. The stone which the builders rejected became this cornerstone. This originally was about this, when the people came back from exile, they took a stone from the originally destroyed temple and used it for the cornerstone of a new temple. So what is Jesus comparing himself to when he says the stone that the builders rejected, this one has become the cornerstone? From the Lord this came to be. He's basically claiming for himself that he is going to be the cornerstone of the new temple, because he's already predicted the destruction of the old one. Because this passage is quoted from a psalm that was written about the rebuilding of the temple after the Neo-Babylonians destroyed it. The people came back from exile and rebuilt it using a stone from the original temple as the cornerstone of the new temple. So we've got layers on layers on layers of meaning here. We have 1.5 minutes for questions. And don't tell me somebody doesn't have a question.
Yes, I wanted to ask, why would the prophet not be arrested for a prophetic act?
Because there was, well, I mean, they could probably detain him, but they're looking for a charge to put Jesus to death. A prophetic act is not a death-causing event. I'm sure the king would have sent out his soldiers quickly to get Jeremiah off the streets. It says he slipped away. but they couldn't put him to death for disobeying the king because he didn't. He gave the same message without words. Jesus gave the same message without words. They could have probably arrested him for disturbing the peace, which would be a fine, but they couldn't do anything else to him. They want to destroy him. Okay? Does that
Yes.
answer the question?
Yes, thank you.
Anybody else? Things are getting thick and heavy in this gospel. Are there any other questions? Well, then I'll have to sign off. Have a great week, everybody. See you next week.
Thank you very much, Prof, and
You
everyone.
too.
Thank you.
How do I get rid of
Thank
this?
you,
There it
Professor.
is. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.
Come on, Abe, Anthony, and good. Okay, I'm going to close up
Good night.
here. Bye-bye.